To see, to hear, to touch, to kiss, to die with thee again in sweetest sympathy.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Angela Cox, and I'm giving the talk this morning. Well, I'm going to transport you back to the 17th century with a man of honour and fidelity in all places. Now, this portrait of James Stuart is extraordinarily intimate, and that's partly because of the horizontal format of a seated figure cut off abruptly below the waist, and so it brings the sitter closer to the viewer, but even more so by the clothes, or rather the lack of them. He's depicted in his shirt sleeves, a great swathe of red silk draped across the right shoulder and his lap. His fingers lightly fondle a greyhound that looks searchingly at its master. James's silky blonde curls fall predominantly over his left shoulder in the fashion of the time, and the expression is direct, somewhat aloof, and we are in no doubt that we are looking at a young nobleman, refined and elegant, a man comfortable in his own skin. James sits on an upholstered chair, a hunting spear against the wall. Behind him, a large figured velvet curtain and a glimpse of wooded parkland beneath the late afternoon sky. The portrait is undated. A probable age and biographical events in his life suggest it's about 1636 when he's 24 years old. There is on the upper right, I can show you here, there with cursor, is an inscription which says L. Stuart, Duke of Richmond, but in fact that was added at a later date. I want to look first of all at the life of James Stuart, 4th Duke of Lennox and 1st Duke of Richmond, a man of honour and fidelity in all places, as he was later described. He was born in London in 1612, the eldest son of Esme Stuart, 3rd Duke of Lennox, and a 3rd cousin of James I, who was James Stuart's godfather. In 1624, his father died suddenly, and James, at the age of 12, becomes the 4th Duke of Lennox. This, by the way, is a Scottish peerage. At 1625, Charles I succeeds, and James, who is now 3rd cousin to the king, is appointed Gentleman of the Bedchamber. Bear in mind, he's only 13 at this stage. In 1633, he's 21. He attains his majority, and he is appointed Knight of the Garter, which is the highest order of chivalry, and a Privy Councillor, which means that he is in constant attendance on the king. The history of the time, of course, is that in 1629, in other words, a few years earlier, Charles has prorogued Parliament, which means that he is ruling independently, personally, without calling Parliament. And that lasts for 11 years. In August of 1637, James marries Mary Villiers. She's only 15, but she is already a widow. The widowed Lady Herbert. She had married at the age of 12, the son and heir of the Earl of Pembroke. She was also, by the way, the daughter of the Duke of Buckingham, who'd been a favourite, particularly of James I and also of Charles I, and had been assassinated in 1628. In November 1640, the Long Parliament, which eventually tried and found guilty of treason the king, starts its sitting. And in 1641, James is created Duke of Richmond. Now, this is an English peerage. We will leave his life at that moment and return to it later. Now, let's have a look at the artist, Anthony van Dyck. I was intrigued to be reminded a couple of weeks ago that he was born in the same year as Velázquez, 1599, though he was born in Antwerp, which at this time was ruled by Spain. It was the Spanish Netherlands. And He becomes apprenticed to a painter, Hendrik van Baarle, and like Velázquez in 1618, he is registered as a master of the St. Luke's Guild. In other words, he is a fully trained painter. He begins working not only on his own account, but works in Rubens' studio as one of Rubens' assistants. And he is described by visitors to this studio as the best of his pupils. Now, being the best of his pupils, he doesn't want to stay longer than is necessary. He is a highly talented and an ambitious young painter. So he knows that he has to begin on his travels. And he comes very briefly to London in October 1620, but stays only a few months, and then leaves to do a much more useful and extensive tour to Italy from 1621 to 1627. And he travels widely. And for him, the impact of the Italian masters, especially the Venetian painters, Titian in particular, is very important on the development of his style. He tones down the vigor and the robustness of color of Rubens in favor of something rather more elegant and with more delicate color harmonies. He has very fine looks. He has a good manner. He is every inch the courtier artist. In 1627, he returns to the Netherlands for a few years, becomes court painter to the Archduchess. And I think what's important to stress, although we know him as a great portrait painter, he was successful in the whole range of subjects, religious pictures, classical and literary subjects, as well as in portraits. And in the 17th century, really to make your name, it was not as a portrait painter, it is in the whole range of other subject matter. And then we hear on the 13th of March, 1632, when the king's agent Balthazar Gerbier writes to Charles I from Brussels, Van Dyck is here, and he says he is resolved to go over into England. Now, feelers have been put out over the last few months in both directions. Van Dyck wanted to move to, as it were, a bigger arena, and Charles I's England seemed to be an ideal proposition. The king was known to be a lavish collector of art, very knowledgeable, and quite happy to spend. And most importantly, Charles wanted an artist of international reputation to grace his court. And Van Dyck saw these opportunities. With Rubens and Velázquez on the continent of Europe, he did not have a chance to shine, as it were, with those two big artists dominating. So he comes to England. He's there by April of 1632, and a few months later, he is knighted by the king. And this is a huge honor. No other artist resident in England had ever been knighted, which puts him on a sort of social level, at least, with the kind of clients that he wishes to attract. He's also given £200 per annum. He is the principal painter in ordinary to their majesties. The king rents a house for him at Blackfriars, and he stays in London for much of the next 9 years until he dies in December 1641. And in the self-portrait that you can see that was painted perhaps a few months later, the sort of the ambition, but also the confidence of this young man who paints himself gesturing towards a sunflower. And a sunflower has a range of sort of symbolic references, specifically devotion, perhaps the faithful subject to the king, devotion, of course, to God, the beauty of God's nature. I mean, all these kind of references spring to mind. And immediately he set to work painting portraits of the king. The first magnificent one, something that was beyond anybody's visual experience, is this portrait of the king with his family. So it's not just simply a portrait of a very regal monarch, which he most certainly is, but emphasizing the kind of family nature of the young royal family. And so we have the grandeur of the pillar and the curtain and a view of Westminster beyond. You can see the River Thames on the left-hand side, the crown and all the rest of it. But at the same time, it's got these kind of domestic touches of little Prince Charles with his hand on his father's knee, as though he's having a conversation, and the Queen looking towards her husband. And another very fine and very delicate and intimate double portrait of the King and Queen on the right-hand side. Well, of course, where the king led, the aristocrats very quickly wanted portrait commissions of their own. And I know it's become commonplace to say that Van Dyck transformed the English portrait in terms of variety and presentation. And perhaps one of the best ways to show this is to be able to give you examples of a portrait that was painted just before Van Dyck arrived of the second Earl of Warwick, and compare it with one painted by Van Dyck some months later. Now, if you look at the Muytens portrait, and I should say this is a Dutch painter who at the time of Van Dyck's arrival was also known as Paynter to the King, though his pension was only £100. And you can see something that is highly competent, beautifully detailed in the costume. The man has got a certain amount of elegance. We have a scene behind of a naval engagement of some sort or whatever. This, of course, points to his colonial interests. He also became Lord High Admiral. But what happens with Muytens, with his whole-length portraits, is we see that balustrade again and again, and we see that red curtain again and again, and the figure itself is very static. Now let's have a look at what Van Dyck does with the same sitter. It has what we would describe as the Baroque characteristics of light, of colour, of movement, and above all, a certain amount of theatricality. I mean, when you think about it, you're unlikely to have a gold curtain hanging from a rock, but that's not about, obvious reality. It's about presentation, and it gives the chance of introducing another colour, the way the light falls on his beautiful silver threaded doublet, the fact that he's turning his head is in one direction, the thrust of his body in another. He's moving on to his left leg. So he's about to move away and he's turned to look at something in the left distance. So the whole thing is full of kind of vitality. And I'm going to show you just a few examples of other portraits to see the extraordinary range that Van Dyck was able to give to the portrait. Here's Lord Wharton, about 1632-34, dressed up in a kind of shepherd's costume, a sort of Arcadian image. Here's the Earl of Northumberland, who became Lord High Admiral. Again, there's another kind of naval engagement to refer to his particular interests. He's rather improbably resting his foot on an anchor, but never mind, turning his head. And the whole thing is full of life and colour. And here, 3/4 length of Lord Digby. Perhaps more emphasis now on the head because it's a 3/4 length rather than a whole length. And now the ladies. Here's the Countess of Carlisle, a lady with quite a reputation, and you kind of get a sense of that in the expression of her face as she parts the curtain and kind of invites you to enter the interior with her. A lady of a rather different type, the rather modest and plump-faced Countess of Bedford, and here on the right, Mistress Anne Kirk, who seems to be gesturing and having a conversation with somebody again on the left-hand side. She's drawing her skirts away as she walks across the canvas. And in all three portraits, because these are young women, we have roses, rose bushes in the background as symbols of love and beauty. So, when you see these kind of presentations, you can understand why Van Dyck is so enormously popular. And indeed, Daniel Muytens can't compete, and he returns to his native Delft a couple of years later. Right, let's get back to our portrait. There are 4 portraits of James Stuart by Van Dyck. This one at Kenwood, this one here in the Louvre, this one here in the Metropolitan Museum of New York, in which he's depicted whole length with a beautiful black suit, a greyhound again in attendance, and the insignia of the Garter on his cloak. And then finally, this one here on the left, a whole length. And I think when you look at the face, you realize that it's a thinner face. He looks a bit older. The style of the collar is that of about 1640. I think we will remove the left-hand portrait because our attention is really on these three. The traditional dating for all these portraits is as follows. It is thought that the first portrait was painted in 1633, the whole length on the right-hand side where he wears the insignia of the Garter. This is followed by the Kenwood portrait painted a few years later, about 1636. And finally, the Louvre portrait painted a few months later, 1636-37, in which James is wearing the same costume and holding a piece of fruit. Now, the fact that there are two or more portraits of the same, or three portraits of the same sitter is not surprising. Let's have a look at what we have with the whole-length portrait in the Metropolitan Museum. Fortunately, two preliminary sketches have survived. And you can see that what Van Dyck has done, and I will read the description of him at work to remind you of what you're looking at. He, Van Dyck, would take a little piece of blue paper and look upon the life and draw his figures and postures all in sudden lines, as angles with black chalk, and heighten them with white chalk. So when the sitter first presents himself to Van Dyck in his studio, he decides on a posture, and that's what we can see. He's not bothered yet about the head. He also at some point takes the opportunity, because he's decided to pose him with the dog, to do a wonderfully detailed sketch of the greyhound, which presumably he will only see on one occasion. Now, Van Dyck only had hour-long sittings, so the sittings were really used to get the features of the face accurately. The costume would be left in his studio and wouldn't need to bother the sitter any further. Now, the fact that two or more portraits use the same face pattern suggests that there was perhaps a more detailed sketch of the head was kept in the studio. We don't know, because it has not survived. When it came to the composition for the whole-length portrait, he adapted one that he'd already used for the Earl of Strafford, probably a year or two earlier, showing him with a dog. But the Strafford portrait is closer in feeling, although the dog, which is wolfhound in both cases, has been transferred to the other side, basing it on Titian's portrait of the Emperor Charles V, which was one of Charles's most prized possessions in his collection. The younger man, James Stuart, has got a beautiful greyhound who sort of rests rather lovingly against his leg. So this is to remind you of the dating, or the traditional dating, of these portraits. The first one is the whole length with the Garter insignia. The second one is our portrait at Kenwood. And the third one is the portrait now in the Louvre with the piece of fruit. Now, very recently as last summer, an art historian, Flemish art historian, who I hope I pronounce her name correctly, Yahel San-Salazar, who is an expert in Dutch and Flemish 16th and 17th century painting. She's an expert on Rubens and Van Dyck, looked very specifically at the Louvre portrait, the one with the piece of fruit. And she has challenged the traditional hypothesis of the order of the dating of these portraits. And she suggests that the Kenwood portrait is in fact the first of these three to be painted, the original one. So I'm now presenting you with her dating, about 1636 for the Kenwood, 36, 37 for the Louvre portrait, and a little bit later for the Metropolitan Museum portrait. Her hypothesis is based on a number of facts. She particularly believes that the quality of the painting of these three portraits is finest in the Kenwood portrait, particularly the quality of the paintings of the heads. Now, I should remind you that what you're looking at are not the original paintings. You are looking at photographic copies. And these photographic copies may not be as good in resolution as they might be. So this is what we have to look at. Now, what I want you to notice are a number of things. She feels that the quality of the painting of James's head at the Kenwood portrait is particularly fine. And what she comments on is certain aspects of his face. First of all, there is a mole here. I don't know how well you can see this, which is replicated, interestingly, on this portrait there, but doesn't appear in the Louvre portrait. But the most particular difference, now that you're looking at them in detail, is the set of the eyes. Do you notice that the left eye has a very heavy lid over it and makes a very distinct and particular facial feature? Now, this is there in the other two, but nothing like as particularized, not so specific. She also comments on the modeling of the face being more subtle. I think that's probably a bit difficult for us to see. Though when I look at the Metropolitan Museum portrait, I notice that he's got a slightly fatter, slightly plumper face. But the other thing she points out, and again, I think we can see it in these examples, is the quality of the painting of the hair. If you look, for example, at the lower part of the fashionable lovelock, you can see very, very fine painting of the curls. He's using different brush strokes, but particularly in this one, it's much more generalized, and even so in this one here. So this is why she believes that that is the actual dating of these portraits. Now, before we look and discuss this any further, I just want to make a particular point about a painted portrait. We have surviving, miraculously, this absolutely wonderful drawing of Charles I on the right-hand side. And Van Dyck has noticed that, again, the set of the eyes, no face, as you know, symmetrical. And he's noticed, again, that there's a slightly heavier lid here. The eyes are not symmetrical at all. And he's absolutely focused on the particular arrangement of his features. Now, when he translates that into a painting, which he does in this famous one of Charles I in 3 positions. Now, this drawing is around in his studio, and he can obviously refer to it whenever he needs to paint a portrait of the king. You notice that, yes, it is most definitely the same face. He's looked at it very searchingly again, but he's slightly generalized it. He's not been so specific about the set of the eyes in exactly the same way as he is in the drawing. And I think what is very, very important to realize that even in this painting, the triple heads portrait, which was going to be looked at very, very closely, as perhaps you know, by Bernini, the sculptor in Rome, who was commissioned to make a marble bust of the king, was never actually going to be able to see him. So this portrait was there as a sort of model for him to work from. Even when this was going to be scrutinized so closely, he still slightly modifies or generalizes the king's face, because portraits are for all time. And as somebody commented just a little bit after he died, he took his time to draw a face when it had its best looks on. And that goes on to say, without altering the likeness. In other words, it looks absolutely like the king. And when I saw this drawing in that wonderful Royal Academy exhibition some years ago of Charles I's collection, I hadn't seen it before, as it were, in the flesh. I was completely struck by the fact, oh my goodness, it's slightly different from all those other faces. So I want you to recognize that the painted portrait for all time is not like, you know, a modern snapshot. Let's get back to the business of the fruit. Now, as far as various art historians have commented on this piece of fruit, it has been identified as a lemon, as pear, as an apple, and for all these various pieces of fruit, because obviously this is like the main object in the painting, apart from James himself. It clearly is not there as a matter of accident, and he seems to have plucked it from the tree behind him. You can see there are 3 more pieces of fruit very visible in the painting. So it's there for a purpose. It must have a symbolic meaning. Anyway, Yael Sansalazar has put forward the hypothesis, and I think this is very convincing, that what we are looking at is in fact a quince. And she makes the case by referring, well, not endlessly, but with many examples, to how the quince in antiquity was associated with marriage. It appears in emblem books, and Van Dyck uses emblem books for symbols in his portraits. So it seems to me pretty convincing that the painting is intended as a portrait at about the time of marriage. And I'm pairing it with a portrait of Mary Villiers, who he was to marry in August of 1637. If you may remember, she was already a widow. She'd been married at 12. Her husband, Lord Pembroke, had gone on a grand tour because he was only 15, and he died of smallpox in Florence. So she was almost immediately widowed. And she gestures in her portrait to black bows, or black bow on her bosom, which indicates widowhood. So if we put the portrait as a marriage portrait, then we can give it this 1636 or 37 date. Incidentally, the king arranged this marriage between James and Mary Villiers. So do we accept the argument of the dating? Well, I'm slightly skeptical about the fact that the whole-length portrait was painted after the other 2. And the reason for this is twofold. James Stuart is quasi-royal. He's the 3rd cousin of the king. In 1633, he gains his majority. He becomes a Knight of the Garter. He's a Privy Councillor. Is he at the end of a long queue of aristocrats waiting for their portraits to be painted? I think it is unlikely that he would not have a portrait painted till about 1637. And the other thing that makes me doubt her hypothesis of putting him, as it were, at the end of the list of these portraits is something about context. This is a whole-length portrait. It would be hung high in a very public position. Getting such specific detail of the features of the face, painting it with such meticulous care, would not be necessary. It's the whole confection, it's the whole presentation, the whole appearance. It is not a private portrait in the way that the other 2 quite clearly are. Right, enough about all those. Let's go back to our painting. Now, no compositional drawing survives. We don't know what occasioned the Kenwood portrait. We are very aware of the informality of the dress. It has often been suggested by various art historians over the years that it may be a reference to a character in a court masque. Certainly, there is no other portrait showing a figure in such undress as this one. So this is unique. One of the reasons that the Flemish art historian dismisses the idea of him being Paris, possibly, is that Paris is generally shown, as a shepherd, sort of semi-naked. And clearly, in none of his portraits is James Stuart semi-naked. But nonetheless, despite this undress, the fact that it clearly was intended for, as it were, private viewing, we are still, with other elements in the portrait, speaking here of nobility. The faithful greyhound, the dog, is a classic symbol of loyalty. In this case, dog to the man, and also James to his king. And there is a story that his dog once saved his life, but this is just a story, and we have no direct evidence that that ever actually happened. I'm also putting up on the left-hand side, just for some kind of comparison, this idea of dressing up, the portrait of his brother, painted about a year later, his brother, Lord George Stuart. He's dressed again in a sort of shepherd's outfit, rather like the portrait you saw earlier of Lord Wharton. But we know that this is a man of high status. We have the faithful greyhound, which is a classic symbol of loyalty, dog to the man, as James perhaps is to his king. We have the high status of the hunt referenced here as well. We have this figured velvet curtain, which appears in other portraits by Van Dyck. Here's an example of about the same time, maybe a year later, of the Earl of Arundel with his grandson Tom. Again, rather incongruously, the velvet curtain hangs for a piece of some sort of rocky background, but that doesn't matter. And so we are very much given the sense that, informal though this might be, it is also a man of high status. Well, we left James Stuart, 4th Duke of Lennox, already having been created Duke of Richmond in 1641. So now I will continue with his life story. He was appointed the year before as Warden of the Cinque Ports. Now, the Cinque Ports were the major ports on the southeastern edge of England, I mean, on the Channel, facing France or the Netherlands. So although now it is basically just a sort of courtesy title, at that time it was a very important post for defence. And of course it carried with those responsibilities, and also it carried a considerable amount of wealth through fishing and so on. He's created Duke of Richmond, as I said, in 1641. And to remind you that in 1642, the First Civil War breaks out. And during the course of the next few years, 3 of James's brothers die in battle. Lord George, who you've already seen, and the double portrait by Van Dyck of Lord John on the left and Lord Bernard on the right, they also die in that First Civil War, and I know you're familiar with those portraits. During the course of the war, of course, there were battles all the way through it, but there were also many opportunities for mediation, for discussion between Charles I and Parliament. And James is always there. And the evidence suggests that James was always suggesting toleration between both sides, giving a bit and so on to prevent more bloodshed. But Charles is adamant he's not giving in to any of the demands of Parliament. At the end of the First Civil War in 1646, there is stalemate, and James takes no further part in discussions with Parliament. He withdraws. And of course, as things get worse and worse, there's another civil war breaks out in 47, and eventually Charles gets defeated pretty comprehensively. As, of course, one of the king's most loyal supporters, James is in considerable difficulties, and Parliament extorts huge fines, but he formally gets pardoned, so he's not considered in any sense a traitor. The worst happens, as I'm sure you know. Charles is convicted of high treason. He's sentenced to execution, and this takes place on the 30th of January, 1649, outside Whitehall Palace. And then on the 9th of February, James, as his closest English relative, supervises his funeral at Windsor Castle. He's absolutely devastated. He's described as heartbroken, and he basically retires to live as quietly as possible outside the radar of Parliament. One happy event, the birth of a son, Esme, in 1649, but just have a look at the date of his death, 1660, And then in July of 1651, the birth of a daughter, Mary, and again, look at her date, she dies in 1668. And then James, at the age of 43, basically having gone into a decline, himself dies on the 30th of March, 1655. There are two more extant portraits of him. I apologise for not having rather better examples of them. One by Adrian Hanneman, a Dutch painter living in London in the 1620s into the 30s, and the other one by Theodore Russell. They're not actually based on a Van Dyck, although the presentation is quite clearly similar to a Van Dyck. It's a face very much more drawn. I think the Russell is probably slightly better quality, but it's difficult to tell from black and white photographs. They would have been painted in the course of the 1640s. Notice, in fact, that he's wearing the Garter badge, or at least there's some reference to the signia of the Garter in both portraits. I actually also ought to have remembered to get you to realise that there's no reference to the Garter in the Kenwood portrait or the Louvre portrait, and this adds to the sense of complete informality, because in any formal occasion, a Knight of the Garter appears with some reference to the signia. Well, James dies in 1655, and mounting debts make it difficult for his widow to manage in England, not a very comfortable place to be either in the 1650s. And she moves in 1658 to Paris. 2 years later, her son Esme dies of smallpox in 1660. And she then returns after the Restoration, if you remember, that's in May 1660, to London, and with the body of her son, and buries him in the same vault in Westminster Abbey, the Lennox tomb, in other words, with his father and his antecedents. And she commissions a portrait from John Michael Wright, which is imbued with a feeling of melancholy, with a feeling of sadness, in which she is depicted with her already dead son, who's central to the composition, and her daughter Mary, who in fact also dies, not very much later. And the symbols of the portrait, particularly this rather odd object, is actually metal. It depicts a snake biting its own tail, and it's known as an Ouroboros, and it's a symbol of eternity. And the Narcissus is a symbol of renewal, of rebirth. So it creates this image of the departed soul of the young boy, and maybe also the departed soul of the Duke. It's a very, very soft and delicate portrait. As for Van Dyck, well, in 1639, he marries Lady Mary Ruthven. He's 40 years old, but clearly, things are not too good. The king is horrendously short of money. Commissions are not going to be forthcoming. But most importantly, perhaps of all, it's becoming increasingly uncomfortable for any Catholic figures to survive. There are riots, stones are thrown at Catholic residences. He's feeling very insecure. And he begins in the spring of 40 to leave London and goes to Europe. He visits the Netherlands and Paris. He's clearly on the lookout to re-establish himself out of England. However, although Rubens dies in 1640, in May 1640, he might have had, as he hoped, the opportunity to pick up the commissions that would have perhaps normally have been given to Rubens. He's already increasingly frail. And by late November 41, when he returns to London, he is dying. The king is devastated by the possible loss of his court painter and probably even friend. And he sends a doctor to try and see if he can save his life, but of course to no avail. On the 1st of December, his daughter, Justiniana, is born. But on the 9th of December, Van Dyck himself dies. and he's embedded in St. Paul's Cathedral, and the king orders this inscription to be placed on his tomb. Van Dyck, who, while he lived, gave to many immortal life. And I'm showing you this late self-portrait. Gone is that sort of confidence, that joie de vivre that we saw in the earlier self-portrait. Finally, of course, let's return to Kenwood. The first recording of this portrait is not through his descendants, which you might have expected because it's such an intimate and personal image. It's first recorded in 1659 in the inventory of the Countess of Leicester, and then descends down the Sidney family until it is sold in 1889 and bought by Edward Cecil Guinness. And it has often been noted, it's rare for Guinness to buy male portraits, he tends to buy female ones, but he clearly couldn't resist this wonderful painting. Well, how do I end? We all do. The hindsight of the tragedy to follow in the 1650s, the high price James had to pay for his personal loyalty, the death of 3 of his brothers, the death of the king, and massive debts, because he loaned the king £96,000, that's nearly £100,000, and you have to multiply that by 100 to get today's figure. So he all through the 1630s, he was lending him money, and more so in the 40s. And then the massive debts he had to pay to Parliament. And I think it's kind of hard not to see kind of some sense of melancholy in his expression, and possibly a bit of foreboding in the landscape. I think that's rather romantic, and I apologise for that.